We're going to, the session is entitled Projects of Identity with the S in parentheses, and the papers will be read as listed on the program. Each speaker will have 20 minutes, including me, and then we'll open up for discussion. The first speaker is Alon Wiener, The Ongoing Cultural Contradictions, Russian Rock Music Counterculture in Israel. Alon.
I'll begin with a quote from a book by Thomas Kuntsman entitled Notes from the Underground, which is about rock music in the Soviet Union. He says, rock music and rock musical counterculture stood as a cultural contradiction to the world of socialist industrial modernity, yet the rapid capitalist development of Russian society has, in a sense, contradicted this cultural contradiction. A very complicated and contradictory phrase, and I'll try to explain it in the following minutes. So indeed, the development of capitalism in the former Soviet Union, and especially in Russia, has put to the test the values and beliefs of many hardcore rock musicians and enthusiasts. In a sense, the Soviet officialdom of the 1980s proved to be an easier adversary to counter than capitalism. Rock culture's descent in the 1980s USSR was expressed mainly through nihilism and an almost total detachment from the official social discourse. They believed that to criticize the regime using political terminology is actually to adhere to the official discourse, a practice they tried to avoid. Strange as it may seem to an outsider, the social conditions in the Soviet Union in the 1980s were more suitable for a seclusive ideology than the conditions that reigned in the immediate post-Soviet period. The growing gap between people and party and state in the 80s resulted in a gap between the private and the public spheres, causing people to use authentic discourse in their kitchens while half-heartedly participating in the compulsory charade of official discourse. In emerging capitalist conditions, however, detachment and seclusion were harder to achieve. The reasons were numerous. Obviously, evolving conditions presented rock artists with the opportunities for fame and fortune, a temptation many found difficult to reject. Supporting oneself has also become difficult. While in the Soviet period, rock musicians managed to find high-paying, hard-working jobs that required 2-3 shifts a week and left the rest of the time free from music, the new economical conditions and the rapid inflation have made it harder for rock musicians to create music only for art's sake. Staying out of politics was another principle that became harder to abide by. In the 80s, the choices were either to participate in the official political discourse or to take no part in it. In the 90s, however, an abundance of parties and views appeared amidst the politically starved Russian society. While some rock artists decided to support various political agendas, others preferred to remain in their politics-free zone. The crystallization of the hard rock enthusiast discourse took place against this background. Distinctions were sharpened between art and commercialism, creativity and political agenda, and between the art of rock music as opposed to popular culture, or simply pop. In the eyes of hardcore rock enthusiasts, the rock community, with its center in Leningrad, or St. Petersburg now, has split into two camps: those who taken to pop, or in Russian, apopseli, and those who remained loyal to the old values. Already in 1989, in a preface to a collection of rock texts, Ilya Smirnov, the editor, wrote that today rock is at the crossroads again, and again has to solve a conflict. Should it stay in art or dissolve into the so-called Soviet Estrada? Soviet Estrada is the mainstream government-sponsored pop music. That is actually an imitation industry. Yeah, the Estrada is an imitation industry, something like a cheap restaurant that suits all tastes. This conflict was distinctly sharpened after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Paradoxically, in the struggle against heresy, the hardcore rock enthusiasts employed Soviet anti-oppositionist rhetoric. As in the Soviet discourse, there was no place for liberalism or pluralism. You could either be a friend or foe, nothing in between. Like in Soviet cosmology or any other eschatological discourse, the most dangerous enemy is the one from within, the one that seems to share your path but actually undermines you. The crusade that the Dead Shevchuks, an Israeli Russian rock group, has taken against Yuri Shevchuk, the leader of DDT, which is a Russian rock group, and an icon of Soviet Russian rock for over 20 years, demonstrates this way of thinking. Targeting Shevchuk demonstrates how Russian rock community in Israel has taken a more conservative stance in the debate between the old school rockers and the new generation. Shevchuk, who maintained a solid and very non-experimental musical career since the early 80s, has been blamed by the Dead Shevchuks for going popish or going towards pop and succumbing to new trends, something that he has not been accused of by his loyal rock fans in the former Soviet Union. For Russian rock fans, for example, the sight of rock groups performing at political rallies for large sums of money has become common. Their counterparts in Israel are still startled at the fact that groups like Chaif and Sirga played at politically sponsored concerts during the last couple of years. I feel like a soldier fighting a war that has already ended, says Ilya from Bat Yam, a person I've interviewed, an organizer of amateur rock concerts and a well-known figure in the Israeli Russian rock scene. He is also dismayed at the unholy alliance between the 1980s rock musicians, politics, and money. Like many of his fellow rock enthusiasts, he feels that the Israeli rock community has become the last fort of authentic rock culture, an outpost that stays standing despite the surrender of the main fort in Russia. Ilya immigrated to Israel in 1993 at the age of 19. Like many of his fellow hardcore rock enthusiasts, he imported values and moral outlook on the question of art versus commercialism from the early 90s rock scene in Leningrad. Ilya doesn't work regularly. He lives with his parents, his grandparents in a small apartment and dedicates his free time to reading and organizing amateur rock concerts, something he does voluntarily without getting paid, which is a very common phenomenon even in Russia in the Soviet times. His close circle of friends, all rock enthusiasts like him, share his lifestyle. Having immigrated to Israel in their early teens, they were supposedly excellent candidates for a successful absorption process within the Israeli community. Nevertheless, most of these rockers seem to be very uninvolved in Israeli culture, as they are in Israeli society. When asked, "How Israeli do you feel?" Masha, a 27-year-old rock fan, answers, "I don't feel I have very much in common with this culture. Nevertheless, I'll know at which side to point the gun when a war with the Arabs starts." That's his main connection to the Israeli culture. He knows which side he's not on. That's the only thing he has in common. Indeed, having preserved their closed community lifestyle, Russian rock fans have transferred their cultural scene, almost intact, to Israel. The interaction with Israeli culture is minimal and takes place only at marginal points. They don't consider themselves Israeli, nor Jewish. Most of them don't consider themselves Jewish. It doesn't have anything to do with their actual ethnic origin. They don't know but they know which camp to join if the worst comes to the worst. Although they certainly interact with other Olim more than they do with native Israelis, they rarely get involved with their political agenda. This small community relies on its own information network and does not, for example, use the local Russian press to announce upcoming events. Most of the messages and announcements are passed by electronic mailing lists, billboards, and simply verbally from member to member. Interaction with Israeli rock fans and musicians, a marginal current in itself in Israel, is almost non-existent. Russian rock fans consider rock to be a culture comprised of three non-separable elements: music, text, and context. Since music, which cannot stand by itself according to them, is the only common factor they have with Israeli rockers, interaction is not feasible. So far, I've examined the role that the values imported by the Russian rock fans from the 1980s Soviet Union have played in their socialization process in Israel. But what of the Israeli culture, politics, and society? What role have they played in this unsuccessful absorption? Okay, what is the role of the Israeli society in this? You know what bothers me most, says Ilya, the same Ilya I've spoken about previously? It's the fact that they have it all planned out for me. I'm supposedly part of a process where Jews return to their historical motherland, and now I'm supposed to be grateful. I'm supposed to give up my culture for a new one. I didn't come here to rejoin my historical motherland. I didn't even want to come. I came here for the sake of my grandparents. Indeed, many members of his milieu claim that they didn't initiate Aliyah. They were either compelled to come since they were underage, or since it was for the benefit of their family members. Another interesting fact is that members of this community seem to find parallels between the Israeli and Soviet political discourse, making them both equally loathsome. Again, a quote, "All politicians do here is talk about plans for the future. It reminds me of the communists," says Slavik, a 37-year-old rock poet, that's how he defines himself, who came here at the age of 25. The left talks about how great it will be after we make peace with all our wonderful neighbors. The right is planning a war of Armageddon to get rid of them, and they all promise you that in 20 years everything will be okay. Well, I'm more interested in the next 20 minutes. Rejection of eschatological political discourse is something Slavik and his friends inherited from their proclaimed forefathers. Soviet rock musicians in the 1980s USSR show a total detachment from official discourse, while Gorbachev, responding to social claims that first emerged in the early 50s, introduced the perestroika and its social plan, glasnost, as a means to redirect the Soviet Union back on its utopian course, the rock musicians no longer adhered to a eschatological discourse. Their lyrics were filled with nihilism, iconoclasm, and fundamental dislike for the notion of the collective. Israeli political discourse and the Zionist discourse both use many eschatological motives. Both serve in this case as a deterrent from deeper involvement. The trauma of the transition from a socialist society to a capitalist society, capitalist post-industrial society, is another issue that enhances the rift between the immigrant rock enthusiasts and the Israeli culture. Rock enthusiasts that stayed in the CIS or the FSU after the collapse of the Soviet Union have experienced several moral dilemmas while dealing with this kind of transition. The main issues that arose include the preservation of one's musical identity in the face of the capitalistic drive threatening to turn art into a commodity, and the dilemma of money, a factor which was missing from the cultural equation of rock music in the USSR before the collapse of the USSR. The evolving capitalism in the post-Soviet arena was not a simplistic one. It was not a war between greedy opportunists ready to sell their values and cultural saints that refused any gains. The conflict was more complex, and it revolved around the role of money as a liberating and an identity-preserving force, as opposed to a devastating force that corrupts identity. Arriving in Israel in the early 90s, those Russian rock enthusiasts encountered a society where capitalism was well established, and these moral dilemmas were well resolved. In this sense, their worst nightmares were realized, in the sense of entering into an established capitalist society. We have established the fact that Russian rock enthusiasts' detachment from society and from official discourse has transcended geographical boundaries and was transferred to their new country. The fact that their new country had messianic expectations from them and the eschatological discourse their new society welcomed them with served as a pretext for further social entrenchment and the preservation of their alternative counterculture. Nevertheless, on many occasions, their views on what is right and what was wrong concerning issues of art versus commercialism and inclusiveness versus seclusion were far more conservative than their counterparts that remained in Russia. This phenomenon cannot be explained merely by their physical distance from Russia. Their counterparts claim that they are entrenched in their old views since they are away from Russia and therefore cannot experience the evolution of Russian society. But this explanation is not sufficient. Another explanation might be romanticism. Many immigrants, especially those forced to immigrate, tend to have romantic notions and nostalgia, as somebody pointed out before, of their former motherland. Since many members of this community consider their immigration as a step they were compelled to take in order to improve their well-being or the well-being of their loved ones, they tend to idealize the motherland they left behind. Some of them take it a bit further and claim that they have a guilty conscience for leaving in the midst of the battle between rock culture and commercialism, thereby abandoning their brothers in arms. In a moment of soul-searching, Elias says that maybe his rigid views are his way of dealing with his guilt, I quote, and trying to compensate for my desertion. To sum it all up, Russian rock counterculture in Israel, although a Soviet phenomenon, has managed to maintain its main characteristics, such as detachment from official discourse, an uncommercial and an apolitical approach to art. Although this counterculture was formed against specific social Soviet conditions and served as a contradiction to a unique discourse and to a certain official culture, it still found enough parallels between both societies to preserve its contradictory role here in Israel. Another factor that helped forge their identity was the transition from socialism to capitalism, a transition they've already encountered in post-Soviet Russia prior to their aliyah. Paradoxically, although they belonged to a milieu that served as an alternative culture to the official Soviet culture, the social conditions that reigned after the collapse of the Soviet Union proved more difficult for them to operate in. Therefore, the transition to capitalism in the former Soviet Union did not change their role as a counterculture, and their encounter with capitalism here in Israel kept that role alive for a long time. Thank you.
Thank you, Alon. If it was freezing in the morning, it's now getting a little bit warm. If we can maybe raise the AC, that would be great. The next speaker is Ina Leikin, and she'll be discussing People of the War, Soldiers of the Peace, World War II Invalids from the FSU in the Israeli public space. Ina.
Each year, on the 9th of May, dozens of elderly Russian immigrants with flesh and medals march in an organized parade through the streets of Israeli Jewish cities. They are marching to commemorate the victory of Nazi Germany in the Second World War. On the 9th of May 2004, at 9 o'clock in the morning, I was standing at the beginning of Rogozin Street, the main street of Ashdod. The road had been closed off by order of the municipality, and the march, accompanied by the music of a brass band, set out on its way. Such parades of the B-medal old immigrants from former Soviet Union have become an integral part of the urban scene in Ashdod. Moreover, their activities are among the distinguishing marks of Russian Israelis there. For almost a year, I have been doing field work among the members of the organization named the Ashdod branch of the Association of the Disabled in the War Against the Nazis. This organization was founded in Israel at the beginning of the 50s with the express aim of integrating a group of Jews, veterans of the Allied armies, into the historical context of Israel. In 1954, the law on disabled veterans was accepted in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament. This law provides the disabled veterans a right to amount of benefits, such as special medical care, various discounts, and so on. The organization had gained fresh impetus since the recent massive wave of immigration from the FSU, which brought with itself approximately 25,000 World War II veterans from all over that vast region. The Ashdod branch numbers some 780 members and function as part of a national association. The average age of the members is between 80 and 90, mostly Russian-speaking immigrants who came to Israel in the 90s. The branch is located in the Mifal Apais National Lottery Community Center in one of the town's neighborhoods. In answer to my question, what does the organization do, Ephraim, the local chairman, had tried to explain the organization's bureaucratic activities. While he was opening a new cupboard full of forms and papers, he pounded the door with his fist and said emphatically, "Everything is here. Here every problem gets done on the spot." Twice a week, he and a number of committee activists had a consulting clinic at the community center where other members of the organization can get some important information regarding their rights, as well as solve a variety of bureaucratic problems. What else, I asked then? Mainly cultural activities, he said. According to him, once a week they hold discussions on the Israeli current affairs. Also, they celebrate birthdays of the members, Jewish holidays, and those they used to celebrate abroad, such as National Women's Day, New Year, and so forth. The leading festival around which their social life is organized, however, is Victory Day of the war against Nazi Germany, the 9th of May. The branch main activities enforcing the law on the disabled from the Nazi war and previously mentioned social activities also includes constant contact with public representatives in the Knesset and the local government. In this presentation, I want to concentrate on the organization activity in the public space of Ashdod. As it transpires through rituals and ceremonies, the public space is an exciting arena where different and overlapping discursive strategies meet. By looking at the members of the organization in these ceremonies and festivals, one can trace the ways they articulate their Russian-Israeli political and civil identity within the Israeli national discourse. Now I want to specify some examples of the commemoration activities in Ashdod as its ethnographic work. For instance, in the entrance to the community center where the organization is located, there is a park with a number of games for children. A close look shows that the park is called Victory Park, and there is a tomb to the hero of the Soviet Union. We set up this park here, Victory Park, Ephraim explained to me, entirely on our own initiative. To tell the truth, the kids defaced the memorial a bit. They damaged it a bit with stones. But we will repay it. Anyway, the park functions, and all this is our merit. Then he added proudly, I tell you something. They, meaning the mayor, members of Knesset, the public figures, recognize us. Apart from this park, there are other such-like memorials in Ashdod. Only recently, a new monument was put up in a commemoration of the 60th anniversary of the victory over Nazi Germany, and the square in which it had been erected was renamed the Victory Square. For the further analysis, I would like to depict the design of this monument. Two stone bars in the shape of a V enclose a globe from which cranes take flight, birds that symbolize the eternal wandering of war veterans according to Soviet mythology, as it was masterly depicted in the famous Soviet film The Flying Cranes. All this symbolizes the status of the organization's member in the public space. The grounded bars represent the prominent earthly presence of the members of the organization, while the birds represent their symbolic immortality. It is not only the memorial that symbolizes the eternal presence of the organization members in the city, but the following quotes reinforce it. In the public dedication ceremony of the memorial, Gershon Feldman, the deputy mayor, said in his address, "The people remember their heroes. I hope you will live for a long time, because you have to live on for the others, those who are alive and those who died. I believe that in the 70th anniversary, there will be even more people celebrating it. And what is important, you will be all with us." They are 80, 90 years old. The deputy mayor added, "We have various ways of marking the victory, but the true victory is your presence here, together with other residents of the city, as well as with the soldiers and with the youngest, and I salute you." By the word presence, Feldman signified not only the importance of their eternal status, their immortality status, but also their corporeal presence within the social framework of Ashdod, among the inhabitants of the city. The population of my own research, namely the members of the Ashdod branch of Association of Disabled, has its own special characteristic in comparison with other immigrant groups in Ashdod. They are immigrants, but they are old folk as well. The youngest of them is 80. They are disabled war veterans, ex-soldiers. In the Zionist ethos, their place is also marginal. They are not connected to it through the dominant discourse of the Holocaust, but through their fighting in the state army. They are not struggling for a place in the job market. They are struggling, as I will show later, about the past. All these factors place them on the margins of Israeli society, and this finds expression in the public discourse as well. At the last parade in Ashdod, a local policeman turned to me and asked, "Tell me, where do they buy those kilograms of medals from?" "They are a joke." "Why a joke?" I asked. "Because it's not connected with anything," he answered. Having delineated all this, the following pages will attempt to focus on the liminality of this group and to place its activity within three theoretical fields, namely elderly, collective memory, and the citizenship. I would like to begin with the notion of elderly vis-a-vis nation state. According to Hazan, elderly is a liminal cultural and social category which is based on a system of symbols and images that exclude the old person from the social framework. Therefore, in the modern society, elderly occupies a cultural space, a sort of no man's land, which delimits the boundaries of the modern world itself. At the same time, the peculiarity of this category is characterized by the fact that it challenges other significant discourse and undermines the essence of progress and modernism. A conversation with a woman member of the organization can illustrate this notion. Delila, an 85-year-old disabled veteran, was a frontline soldier during the war. In a conversation I held with her, she told me about her first encounter with Israelis. "Once I came out of the club with all my medals on. We were celebrating Army Day. The neighbor started laughing at me while telling me I had too many toys on my chest. I didn't speak Hebrew, so I called out my daughter-in-law in order to explain to them what each and every medal meant. For sure, these medals are my own history, but at the same time, it is a part of their history of their independence and the establishment of their state, but they still call them toys. The image of old age is a product of a particular cultural social context. For this reason, looking at Delila's story is relevant here in view of the meanings of the elderly in Israeli society. On the one hand, by stigmatizing her appearance as childish, these neighbors exclude her from the modern adult space. On the other hand, the way she presents her fight during the war as a part of the Israeli national struggle for independence by the explanation of medals' value paradoxically frees her from the discourse of no man's land, while granting her an honorable status within the social time and the collective memory of Israel. Delila added then, "You know, when I was in Russia, and here too, I visit schools and tell the children about the history of the war. I've learned to talk to children, and talking to Israelis is like talking to children, at the same level." Golden suggests that we should take a fresh look at the process of socialization of Russian immigrants as the process of creating a common imaginary past and future that they and Israelis should hold. According to her, the institution of the nation-state encouraged the immigrants to live a sort of existence that is parallel to childhood by means of the experiential learning processes. This form of existence makes it possible to pass on to the immigrants a few formative moments in national history and to interweave their biography into the social history of the nation. But Delila's image of Israelis as children changed the vector. Thus, curiously, the object of absorption becomes the very one who has to transfer the meaning of national sentiments to its subjects. The connection of her personal history with the founding moment of Israeli nationalism makes Delila herself a socializing agent. In other words, she tries to retell the Israelis their own collective story, which she sees as her duty to pass on to its heirs. It is this replacement of the roles, which by no means an obvious one, that I want to talk about these people's encounter with the collective memory of Israeli nation-state. There is no doubt that the events of the Second World War made a major impact on the process of the establishment and shaping of the Israeli Zionist discourse concerning the dichotomy between nation-state and diaspora. The Holocaust has a symbolic status that stands for what can happen to the Jewish people outside the sovereign borders of the state, and as such it acts as a warning beacon. The attempts of European Jews to rebel during the war represent only a spark of what can become real heroism within the sovereign borders of Israel. The follow will focus on the accents the group in question has on this matter. During the Victory Day celebrations, Ephraim told the audience, Ephraim, the chairman of the branch, "My dear comrades in arms, you are living and breathing proof of the contribution of Jewish soldiers to the crushing of the fascist enemy. It was with your bodies that you defeated it and saved us all. A few days ago, we celebrated Israel's Independence Day. Today we are celebrating Victory Day. But you all understand clearly that if there had been no 9th of May, there would be no Hey Bayar, the Jewish date of Independence Day. I salute all those who brought us victory, all those who freed Jews from the concentration camps. Maybe some of the people whom you freed are even here today. You succeeded in saving some of these people, even if you do not remember them. I salute you and what you did for the nation that you yourself are part of. You are a worthy example of the young generation of our state, the generation which you have taught to defend the state. You are here and you are living proof." Thus Ephraim presents his comrades as Jewish soldiers who fought for Zionist values and for the independence of the Jewish people. This representation of their fighting during the war in the framework of the Soviet State Army as Jewish national heroism compared with the passivity of other European Jews is an attempt not only to free them from the homogeneous category of elderly, moreover, it attempts to fix for Ephraim and his friends a proven place in the Israeli national pantheon. This is how the members themselves insert their past into the present. Together with them, the Russians in Israel are claimed to be the direct heirs of these heroic virtues. In the meeting with the Aliyah Battalion, another social organization of Russian immigrants, Ephraim said to the audience, "The meaning of our victory is Israel's independence. We brought with us our grandchildren and great-grandchildren. That's you. Now it's your turn to defend the independence of Israel. You can be sure that we are with you and we are a huge force in our country." The representatives of the Russian public take on the torch. In the victory ceremony, member of Knesset Sophie Landwehr addressed the members of the organization in these words: "The Jews had no alternative in the Second World War but to fight, because we know the price of peace and the cost of Jewish blood. Soldiers of the war, men of the peace. You were the people who rose up. You were the victors. Thank you for bringing us to Israel. And then she said, you are men of the war, soldiers of the peace, and you are the victors. I would like to refer to these representations of ex-soldiers as the direct precursors of the act of Israeli independence, and at the same time the educators of the outstanding generation that undertook to advance the modern and Jewish values of Israel. I want to concern the encounter between the members of the organization and the collective Israeli memory as a strategy of the present that takes use of the past. They call up for past to struggle for the present and the future of the whole Russian collective in Israel. It is with good reason that Sophie Landwehr turned her phrase on its head and called them the second time, you are men of the war and soldiers of the peace. I also suggest that this will to remember in Pierre Nora terms as a system of practices and ideological mechanism can be explained in terms of the Israeli discourse of citizenship, and thus brings me to talk about the place of the organization members in the field of citizenship and to discuss the link between citizenship and the nation state through their strategies of self-presentation. The sociological debate present the institution of citizenship and the modern nation state in Weberian sense as the site in which mechanisms of social closure find expression. In the case of Israel, the complex relationship between state and nation turned this institution into a field of unmitigated struggle based on inclusion and exclusion, of course. According to Shapir and Peled, the Israeli regime of citizenship consists of three alternative traditions or discourses. Each one of them, while including certain social groups, excludes others. Thus, the liberal discourse presents itself as inclusive on the individual basis. The Republican discourse is endogenous on account of being based on the contribution to the common goal, national goal. The ethnic national discourse sees citizenship as being defined by the membership in the homogeneous ethnic group, and the source of sovereignty in this case is not the state, but the Jewish nation, and the state is a vehicle that carries out its wishes. The theoretical approach of Shapir and Peled allows me to trace the points where the strategies of representation and action of the members encounter. The theoretical approach of Shapir and Peled allows me to trace the points where the strategies of representation and action of members of the organization encounter Israeli nationhood cultural idioms, which, according to Brubaker, are at the center of the authority from which the demand for civil, political, and social rights is derived. The sentence, "We are living and breathing proof of the contribution of Jewish soldiers to the crushing of the fascist enemy," is an effort to remove any doubt regarding the legitimacy of the Russian collective within a Jewish Israeli nation on account of the large proportion of non-Jews within it. We know the cost of Jewish blood is an effort to widen the political borders of the nation beyond its ethnic and territorial borders. They want to present themselves not only as those who saved part of the Jewish people from the concentration camps and gas chambers, but also as those who prepared the ground for the independence of Israel and those who brought the generation that became a true support of the State of Israel. By presenting their contribution to the narrative of the Israeli independence, they request to include themselves in the Republican discourse and together with themselves the whole Russian collective as their direct ear. This discourse tries, in the name of the Republic, to paper over the social cracks and to define the civil project in terms of contribution to the community. Their representation, based on the ideological principles of the nation-state and supported by a complex relationship between the army and the state in Israel, seeks to gain them a legitimate state within the redistribution system of social, economic, and political resources. In conclusion, the liminal characteristic of the population under the present research pushed the latter to the margin of Israeli society and public discussion. They are present in the modern space as seen as irrelevant. Yet, the empirical examination of their activity at the point of encounter with the nation-state shows that this activity is not just a struggle to be remembered. It is through this struggle for their past that they are fighting for the present and the future of the Russian collective and for its victorious presence within the Israeli national discourse.
The next speaker is Adi Kuntsman, and her talk is entitled, with a question, Mesto u Parashi, Russian gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender immigrants navigate sexuality, respectability, and nationhood.
Words of introduction. This paper is part of my wider project on belonging, nation, and sexuality, and it is based on an ethnography of Russian-speaking gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender immigrants. And this paper specifically is based on a discussion of several events that took place in 2002. And the paper aims to explore the way Russian LGBT immigrants navigate sexuality, respectability, and nationhood, while encountering homophobic publications in the Russian-Israeli media. I, like most people, feel disgusted by sodomy. Supported by Israeli liberals, you demand total acceptance, because living with one's filth is not comfortable, and only public opinion can turn filth into pride. But the public opinion of Russian-speaking Israelis won't indulge you. In your letter, you boldly declare that you plan to widen your activities to education and explanatory work, and this we cannot allow you. As the immortal Schwartz said, shadow, know your place. And your place was and is Parashi, by the latrine. These words, written by Russian-Israeli journalist and poet Boris Kamenov, is a piece called The Shadows Demand Rights, Teni Kachayot Prava. Conclude the exchange that took place in summer autumn 2002 between Vesti, the leading Russian newspaper in Israel, and the Russian Forum Against Homophobia and Defamation, a group of immigrants who organized to combat hostile publications in the Russian media. This piece is a response to the letter sent by the Forum to Vesti, explaining the damaging effect of homophobia and presenting the Forum's activities. In his essay, Kamenov positions himself as the voice of the Russian-Israeli community. The community is ritualistically performed through a reference to a literary text. Shadow, know your place, Тень, знай свое место, is a quote from a well-known play by Evgeny Schwartz. The play is a story about a scientist visiting a kingdom of fairy tales. While he falls in love with a princess, his shadow gains a life of its own, and by betraying and using the scientist, marries the princess and becomes the king. The scientist, nearly executed by the new king, is saved when he exclaims, shadow, know your place, an ancient powerful prayer against evil. The play, full of allegories and intertextual references, which sadly I don't have enough time to discuss here, was widely known in Russia. Kamenov's essay draws a symbolic link between the scientist fighting his evil shadow, himself, and his audience of Russian Israelis. All are united in a performative act of expelling the filth, or rather pushing it towards the latrine. Mary Douglas's work on purity and danger is helpful here in understanding how, through imagining homosexuality as dirty, the community of Russian Israelis is constituted as heterosexual. Yet her analysis has its limitations. While Douglas shows how the impure is expelled in order to maintain boundaries, I suggest that the relations between the heterosexual community and the shadow by the latrine, just as the relations between the scientist and his shadow, are far more complicated, historically and culturally. Mesto Parashi, a place by the latrine, is an idiom, long decontextualized and widely used by many. Its origin is in criminal jargon. Parasha is the vessel used in prison cells for excrement. Spatially distant from the bunk beds, Parasha is also marked as the place of social subordination. The person who occupied the lowest part of the criminal hierarchy had to sleep by the latrine. The co-presence of literally, reference to Schwartz, and criminal language in Kamenov's essay stands out as something out of place. The allusion to the immortal writer's authority, as well as the very practice of citing literary texts, marks the high language and a significant part of the Russian intelligentsia's habitus. The prison jargon, on the other hand, is associated with criminality, low-classness, and common profane talk. The two obviously don't belong together. So why do they meet? Have they met before? Their co-presence creates a haunting feeling of something that's not quite right, something ghostly that resists definition. Avery Gordon, in her book Ghostly Matters, positions haunting as the center of sociological analysis. I quote, "If haunting describes how that which appears to be not there is often a seething presence, acting on and often meddling with taken for granted realities, the ghost is just the sign, or the empirical evidence, if you like, that tells you a haunting is taking place. The ghost is not simply a dead or missing person, but a social figure, and investigating it can lead to the dense site where history and subjectivity make social life." End of quote. The ghostly figure of my paper is a shadow by the latrine. Tracing the appearance of this figure in homophobic publications in Russian Israeli newspapers and in the responses of gays and lesbians, I will ask, what is this dense site where history and subjectivity make social life? In order to understand its location and role, I will need to take a detour to a site where the literature habitus of the intelligentsia encountered the criminal jargon of the labor camps. Returning to the present, I will discuss how gays and lesbians, threatened with turning into shadows, call another dense site of the past to their defense. My discussion is inspired by Gordon's epistemology of the ghostly, and takes it one step further by exploring the haunting in the context of cross-cultural transition and relocation in a new society. Everything began with an extremely offensive poem written by Kamenov after the Pride Parade in Jerusalem in June 2002. I will give an English translation in a second for those of you who can't read Russian. It was in no way the first or the only homophobic publication that appeared in the Russian media around that time, but it was defined as a high point by the gay and lesbian immigrants themselves. Similarly to earlier incidents, it generated a lot of frustration, rage, and pain. But this time, the publication also triggered action. A group of immigrants organized the Forum Against Homophobia, launching a police complaint, several appeals to politicians and the press, and also creating a media monitoring group. So what was different about this poem? Here you have the original and the translation. The poem condemned the blasphemy of the gay parade, presenting the marchers as pilgrims who come to Zion to copulate on the temple's altar, ignoring the raging war for national survival. Kamenov blamed Israeli democracy for allowing this to happen. The words used to describe gays and lesbians all come from criminal jargon used in Soviet prisons and labor camps to designate sexuality and gender roles of same-sex contacts among the inmates. Some of these words, like pidar, are widely used outside prisons as insults. The exact meaning of others, like kabli, kovaryalke, is less known to a wider public. What is clear, however, is that Kamenov was not simply disgusted, as he stated in his later piece, quoted at the beginning of my paper. He was using words that wound, using Delgado's term. But why did he choose criminal jargon to do so? Or rather, what was specifically injurious here in these words? The linking of homosexuality with criminality in the Soviet Union was historically and class-specific, although this fact is often ignored or overlooked. Igor Kohn, a Russian sociologist and historian, points out that the constitution of the anti-sodomy law in 1933 was a turning point in the Soviet relations to same-sex contacts. Kohn marks the period between 1933 and 1986 as the time of prosecution and silencing, when many were imprisoned and any notion of same-sex desires in literature, so popular in the early 20th century, the so-called Silver Age, was censored. Since the notorious Article 121 was instituted by Stalin in 1933, according to which men could be sentenced for up to 5 years for homosexual relations, about 1,000 men were imprisoned every year. But not only homosexuals were involved in same-sex relations in detention. Rather, the whole system of camp, quote, encouraged the spread of homosexuality, suggested Kohn. Criminals based their relations of control and domination on sexual subordination, raping and abusing the weaker inmates. These were called opushchene, those who were put down, sexually and hierarchically. In the cells, their place was by the latrine, Parashi. In his description of non-criminal detainees in the Soviet camps, Kohn mentions several intellectuals who had written horrifying memories of their experience of imprisonment. Kohn uses them as historical evidence of the distorted life of the camps that produced perverted sexual relations among men and women alike. As millions of Soviet citizens, political dissidents, religious practitioners, former prisoners of war, and simply family members of the national enemies spent some time of their lives in gulags during the repressions, the symbolic link between homosexuality, criminality, and violence spread to the whole society. Kohn's account can help explain the presence of criminal jargon in the Russian language, as well as the collective trauma associated with political imprisonment in those years. Detached from context, the criminal language embodies the memory of the labor camp system and is a synecdoche for the period of repressions as a whole. But what Kohn's analysis fails to explain is the class nature of this trauma and its sexual politics. In his discussion of the Gulag memoirs, Kohn doesn't mention the deep homophobia of their authors and the fact it was often used by them to distinguish themselves from the mob of criminals. Gulag memoirs show that what made the experience of the camps unbearable, together with starvation and torture, was the very fact of the encounter and the forced proximity to the mob of criminals. Evgenia Ginsburg, for example, described how the criminal inmates stole from the political prisoners and made them work for them. The disgust in her writing is mixed with fear. This fear is even clearer in the description of men's camps, where the political prisoners were in danger of being physically abused and raped by the criminals. Sexuality in these memoirs is always absently present, or using Gordon's words, it haunts. It is the haunting that makes Kamenov's poem so successfully offensive, precisely because the nature of the offense refuses words, yet is at the same time emotionally charged for the intelligentsia audience. The ghostly figure by the latrine, faceless and nameless, embodies the cultural memory of the gulags and the collective trauma of its massive discovery in the 1980s through books such as those by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Evgenia Ginsburg, Varlam Shalamov, and many others. The use of Gulag jargon to describe the parade in Jerusalem re-evokes this trauma, this time merging the sexual and the cultural with the national. The horror of being thrown into the criminal mob is metonymically transformed into the angst of the Jewish nation, fighting its last battle, while the drunken scum celebrate their sins. Kamenov's poem collapses the biblical landscape, created through the words like Pilgrim's March to Zion, the temple, the altar, into today's Jerusalem, on the streets of which the marchers walk. This move is very common, in fact, in the religious as well as some secular national discourses of Israel as the Holy Land. What's unique, however, is the presence of another temporal and spatial imagery, the camps. By using the words such as pider, kabel, kavrialka, the jargon words used to describe sexual roles in the same-sex context, the poem merges the Holy Land with the zona, the gulag. The gulag sexual imagery was clearly picked up as the most offensive part of the poem by gay and lesbian immigrants. It came back again and again when the poem and other homophobic publications were discussed on the gay community's website. One of the participants said that this homophobia is typical of the older generation that grew Parashi, and therefore could not be changed. Another one has jokingly placed Kamenov in a cell, suggesting that the poet himself must have been homosexually abused and was now by the latrine. Otherwise, how would he know about the jargon? Later, when the homophobia section was created in the community's website, the figure by the latrine appeared once again, in the picture of Kamenov behind bars. The image and the word phobia on it can be read as a suggestion that homophobia and hate speech should be put away. But it can also be interpreted as a reversal of the homophobic imagery within the framework of Gulag speak. This interpretation is strengthened by the title of one of the essays that appeared in this section on the site. Kamenov leaves a vacancy by the latrine. Kamenov уступает место в Parashi. The essay described an insensitive and offensive publication in another Russian newspaper. The interesting move is an attempt to attach the haunting horror of the gulags to homophobia, rather than to gays and lesbians. The persistent presence of gulag imagery on both sides of the debate suggests, in Gordon's words, that the haunting is taking place. Mesto Parashi here can be seen as what Sherry Ortner defines a key symbol, an image or object whose role extends beyond itself, an image that contains a note of social meaning. But when it came to activism in the public arena, it was not the gulags, but a different key symbol and a different ghostly haunting that was mobilized by the gay and lesbian immigrants. Shortly after the publication of Kamenov's poem, several people suggested suing the paper or the author for their fascist tricks. Others have rephrased the expression of homophobic disgust with anti-Jewish disgust, demonstrating the danger of such hate speech through a reference to memories of anti-Semitism and the Nazis' dehumanization of the Jews. The reference to fascism and anti-Semitism returned again as the polemic between Vesti and the gay and lesbian immigrants continued. Following the organizing of the Forum Against Homophobia, Haaretz, the leading liberal Israeli newspaper, published a long article where gay and lesbian immigrants talk about their experience vis-à-vis the homophobic attacks in the immigrant press. Sergei Podrazhansky, the editor of the Weekend Supplement, where Kamenov's poem was published, responded with another piece, this time claiming that there was a gay dictatorship in Israel and that Vesti was the only newspaper opposing the censorship of these disgusting perverts. Several members of the Forum wrote outraged letters to the editor, protesting his defense of the homophobic violence, presented as freedom of speech. This piece, quote, "This piece is a suitable text for an introduction to modern fascism course," wrote one, referring to Kamenov's poem, which Podrazhansky had been defending. Another one compared this pseudo-scientific argument about homosexual perversion to the anti-Semitic work of German scientists who described Jewish men as inferior and effeminate, and of course the way these scientific works were used by the Nazis. Yet another compared the life of gays today with the life of Jews in the former Soviet Union, appealing to the shared experience of Soviet anti-Semitism and cultural oppression. The reference to anti-Semitism and fascism is not accidental. It can be interpreted as a strategic attempt by gays and lesbians to restore a sense of imagined community shared with other Russian immigrants through the experience of anti-Semitism prior to immigration to Israel. But more importantly, it brings up another haunting memory, central to Israeli society, that of the Jewish persecution and victimhood. I suggest that when such a powerful collective trauma as the Gulag is evoked, it can be contradicted only by another, no less powerful, that of the Holocaust. The homophobic publication threatened not only the place of the Russian gays and lesbians among the intelligentsia, they also positions them as the enemies of Jewish survival. By evoking the notion of anti-Semitism, the immigrants turn to the ultimate symbolic weapon of Israeli society, and in the same move, reclaim their belonging to the nation. While ideas of liberal democracy, religious beliefs, or class aesthetics can be negotiated, the persecution of the Jews is the unquestionable sign of the prohibited, that which must never happen again, that which serves the very fundamental of the national ideology of the Jewish state and the immigrants' homecoming, that which is used to justify any oppression of non-Jews, that which is believed to ensure the survival of the nation. Thank you.
Finally, Sonia Solomonick and Masha Buman's paper, The Silent Voices in Polyphony, Immigrant Women from the FSU in Israeli Feminist Discourse, and presenting will be Sonia.
A Silent Voice in Israeli Feminist Polyphony. The great literary critic Mikhail Bakhtin tells us, to be means to communicate dialogically. When dialogue ends, everything ends. All else is the means, dialogue is the end. A single voice means nothing and resolves nothing. Two voices is the minimum for life, the minimum for existence. Every fifth person in Israel is an immigrant from the former Soviet Union. About 60% of them are women. Generally speaking, the image of these women in Israeli eyes is rather fixed and more or less stereotypical. Several researchers in Israel have written about this, including Deborah Golden. As a rule, Russian women do not take part in feminist activities. We don't hear them. We may hear about them. The question is why. Is it because they cannot, or because they do not want to, or because they are not feminists? Echoing Bakhtin's words, this paper will suggest that current Israeli feminist discourse is monological and not dialogical, and by that it excludes Russian women. In this presentation, we will be discussing and analyzing these questions in terms of both content and form. By content, we mean the self-image of Russian women. By form, we mean the discourse of Russian women, the way they think, speak, and present themselves. In terms of the content, Russian women had the same emancipatory goals like Western women. That is equal rights, independence, self-realization. Today, they differ from women in the West and from the image in the West, in the sense that they believe that they have achieved these goals. Their belief is set on a solid basis. To understand it, we have to look in brief at the historical development of what in Russia is called the woman question. Until 1905 in Russia, no one really thought about equal rights. One of significant exceptions was Chernyshevsky, who in 1863 published his novel, What is to be Done, dedicated to sex relations and women's status. However, this was a curiosity for the intelligentsia. Following the historic Tsar's manifest of 1905, which legalized political parties, at the first meeting of the Cadets Party, there was only one controversy. Should or should not women have the right to vote? The main argument against women's vote was that Russian women were not ready to take an equal part in public political life. However, thanks to the intelligentsia, women achieved the right to vote, even before the October Revolution, in April 1917. After the Bolshevik Revolution in October 1917, the new government began to create the new man and new society. A leading slogan of that time was erasing borders. In every area, between city and village, poetry and prose, men and women, an absolute equality of rights was declared already in the first constitution of the Russian Federation in 1918. The constitutional rights included a right to vote and to be elected, a right to study, a right to work, a right to rest, and a right to a pension. It should be emphasized that for Western liberal feminism, until the 70s of the last century, all these rights had to be fought for. The ideology of women's equality even provided a new definition of family. In the Soviet encyclopedic dictionary, a family is defined as a free union between a man and a woman possessing equal rights. The new ideology struck roots immediately. As equal members of Soviet society, women literally built the new Soviet society. Women built houses and factories, paved roads, studied, worked, and built families. And like everything meaningful in Russia, women's emancipation became an emphasized literary theme, which in turn defined and constructed new social norms. A striking example is the novel Cement by Gladkov, that was published in 1925 and was to become a paradigmatic text for the whole corpus of Soviet literature called social realism. The heroine, as an equal member of the new society, struggles to establish norms of equality in those spheres of life where the government couldn't impose its force. That is, in private sphere of the family. In the novel, it goes this way. The year is 1921. The civil war is over. Gleb, Dasha's husband, having been away for 3 whole years, finally returns home to his family. However, what he finds is not what he left behind. His wife has become a totally new woman. The popular text reads as a pure communist and feminist manifesto. Dasha, who has arrived home, seems like a totally different person. Not the happy, submissive wife she was when Gleb left. Gleb passionately tries to force himself upon her, but she rebuffs him. She tells him rationally and angrily, I have become a new person. I have learned something fine and new, and I am not just a woman anymore. After you had gone, I discovered I was a real person and learned to value myself. It was very hard, and it cost me dear, but now no one will destroy the pride I have in myself. No one, not even you, Gleb. I will not be a submissive slave with no will of my own. And Nyurka? Where is our Nyurka? Dasha. In the children's home. Gleb. I shall go there tomorrow and bring her back here. All right, Gleb. I've nothing against it. You are the father. But I'm up to my eyes in work. I have no time. So you'll take care of the child, won't you? Gleb. For 3 years. I used to think my wife, Dasha, who is expecting me. At last I get back. It's as if I had been married only in a dream. Here I skip the paragraphs where he blames her of having slept with other men while he was away, and she says that he also slept with other women. To which he answers, women are different. A wife has a different lot, different cares. What is permissible for men is not permissible for women. Dasha. That's a nice thing. A woman has other cares. It's an evil lot to be a slave without a will of one's own, always playing the second part. What kind of an ABC of communism have you studied, Comrade Gleb? Where had Dasha absorbed this power, wonders Gleb, and answers himself. This strength has awakened and been forged from the collective spirit of workers, from years of deadly hardship, from the terrible burden of the newly acquired freedom of women. The price of the new ideology is almost unbearable. Indeed, the novel's heroine, Dasha, pays a terrible human price, the death of her daughter. However, from the new ideological point of view, the new family practices have been constructed. The woman question has been resolved. Gladkov puts the new practices directly and bluntly. These life practices include women's independence, freedom, refusal to be and to remain a sexual object, rejection of traditional feminine roles, striving for self-realization, and not through the family, but on the contrary, through outside activities. In short, Lenin had a ground for his proud declaration that the Russian Soviet Republic liquidated by a single stroke all traces of inequality of the legal status of women and guaranteed her a complete equality by laws. The historic events between the 30s and the 70s increased, to paraphrase Kundera, the unbearable lightness of women's freedom. The 30s was the period of collectivization. The 40s started with the Second World War, followed by a continuation of the Great Terror. In the 50s, the Labor Front replaced the War Front. Khrushchev's thaw in the 60s was followed by Brezhnev's stagnation in the 70s. All and each of these periods was difficult, and in every one of them, women had to take responsibility for their own and for their family's survival. They bore the difficulties shoulder to shoulder with men. Their freedom, in the name of equality, was never questioned or challenged. It's important to note that women's rights were not just a theory or a legal superstructure or literary imagination. Basic problems which haunted Western feminists were non-issues for Russian women. 2 examples will suffice. And oppressed. In the eyes of a Russian woman, there is no contradiction. For a Russian woman, preserving the женственность, femininity, is highly important, alongside with independence, equality, and self-expression. But from the moment she arrives to the West, feminists tell her, look at you, you are a sex object, you sell yourself to a man. The Russian woman, who experiences herself as a subject and views her lovers as her own sexual objects, will stay. I am none of this. I am independent. I work and earn my own money. I marry out of life and my own will. The reply she gets is, this is a false consciousness. End of a missed dialogue. One way to describe and explain the différent in terms of Lyotard is that here we encounter movements in opposite directions, of and in the narratives of the biological versus the social, and the public versus the private. While in the West, the movement is from the biological to the social and from the private to the public, in Russia the movement is opposite, from the social to the biological and from the public to the private. This thesis or explanation demands a brief articulation. First, in Russia there is no representation of the biological. In Russian cultural tradition, gender identification is simply not marked. The famous statement of Freud, anatomy is a destiny, didn't work in the Soviet Union. The destiny of the woman, as well as for the man, was to be a Soviet citizen. As we saw, Gladkov, in keeping with the rest of socialist realist literature, articulates this through the voice of Dasha. Secondly, for many years, the idea of equality was so predominant in Soviet culture that equality grew to be sameness. Differences such as national, genderial, religious had to be erased in order to create one and uniform Soviet citizen. Any diversion from this path was brutally oppressed. Thirdly, Soviet society was theoretically and practically communal. The Soviet repressed communal body. The Soviet repressed communal body had only one and collective gender, which was defined by male and female alike subordination to rituals of a totalitarian regime. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, a desire for non-sameness reappeared, differences emerged quickly, national identity, rediscovery of Christianity, gender. During the Soviet regime, women who were supposed to be the first and the foremost Soviet citizens missed femininity, missed the choice not to be heroes, but fragile creatures, the choice to be taken care of by men, to dress up, make up, and be coquettish. That is without waiving their achievements, of course. In the 70s, when the dictate of ideology somewhat lessened, these feelings became part of the discourse. For example, two famous Russian movies from this period, Moscow Does Not Believe in Tears and Workplace Affair, picture highly successful but lonely women finally fall in love with a man, interestingly, inferior to them in terms of their status. As a result, one regained her femininity, started to dress up, make up, and generally turned into coquettish beauty. Nevertheless, the thought of leaving her public post never occurs to her. As we said, there is no contradiction in Russian consciousness between femininity and equality. So it is not surprising that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, women began to feel that they got rid of the ideological oppression and could be feminine. Being feminine, moving towards the biological, is liberation. The movement we see in Russia today is a move away from the social public representation of equality, back toward recognition of difference and biological differentiation. In contrast, in the West, the feminist movement is towards social explanation and public transparency. The same is true for the public and private dichotomy. The liberalism and individualism of Western culture privileges the private realm. It was the opposite in the Soviet Union. Things could be private, but there was no privacy. Physically, the private way was a rare commodity. For example, the experience of living in a communal apartment didn't leave any physical space for privacy. Such apartments were home to completely separate families who each had their own room but shared common public utilities, a common entrance hall or couloirs in Russian, kitchen, bathroom and toilet. Politically and ideologically, privacy was incompatible with the demands from a Soviet citizen. During the years of the terror, being a wife or a husband or a child was enough to make one a national enemy. And in the later years, to be unfaithful to one's spouse or to wear a stylish dress were considered immoral and persecuted by public reprimand, because they spoke in a private passions and desire. Generally speaking, Soviet life excluded physical, intellectual, and psychological privacy. Even the word privacy does not have a corresponding equivalent in Russian. Women, and not only women, miss their lost privacy. The choice and possibility of the private is liberation. So far for the content, and now let's turn to the question of form, the discourse. Here we suggest the following observations. First, Russian discourse differs radically from Israeli feminist discourse. Israeli feminist discourse is highly influenced by academic Western discourse and is a mixture of modern and postmodern approaches and vocabulary, political, philosophical, psychoanalytic, and literary. On the other hand, Russian public discourse, as well as analytic and epistemological concepts and tools for social analysis, are still largely conducted within the framework of modernity, monological, realist and reflective, of historical materialism that positions critique with meta-narratives which claim universal truth. Also, no connection exists in Russia today between academic thought, discourse and feminism, which has always been considered as bourgeois and alien. Women's talk is not linked to academic talk. Secondly, because the non-existence of the biological and other cultural and historical factors, at this point in time, Russian women lack a discursive apparatus with which to talk about themselves as a sex gender group, both among themselves and to others. In this respect, they are mute. They will have to reinvent themselves and to name their feminism in the philosophy of roti. Moreover, Russian women of Israel feel that their self-realization is hindered here and now more by their being immigrants, lack of language, lack of social ties in veteran Israeli society, different from forms of discrimination than by being women. Inevitably, they feel that their lot is cast with Russian-speaking men rather than with Hebrew or Arabic-speaking women. But our crucial claim is that Israeli Russian women are muted because they are immigrants, because they have not melted in the Israeli melting pot, and most of all because they have not adapted themselves to Israeli feminist logic, paradigms, symbols and discourse. They do not own their right language. Israeli feminists expect that Russian women should think and talk in the Western way that is understandable to them. However, Russian women do not fulfill this expectation. They don't possess the only officially recognized language of the Israeli local hegemony, in which they could have explained themselves, understand the others, and articulate their difference, so evident but invisible, and so essential for their own survival and for recognition by the others, not only in terms of rigid stereotypes and stigma, but in terms of their rights for being and co-being in Israeli society. It is well known that Israeli discourse has remained hegemonic and melting pot oriented, despite the fact that Israel is a country of immigrants and diverse cultures. See Ruth Halper and Kadari Kimmerling. In terms of Mikhail Bakhtin, he claims that Israeli discourse in general and feminist in particular is monological, in struggling to survive the discourse not through the others but about the others, expecting from the others to explain themselves clearly in the ways only understandable to them. The consequences of the lack of recognition and hardly hearable voice of others are that they are excluded accidentally from the mainstream of the feminist discourse. These are cultural and discursive differences, but the difference between intellectual discourses is always political. Those who are excluded from the dominant position of the symbolic discursive supremacy are deprived of voice, of the possibility to speak, to tell about their losses, their pains. This is true for minorities like national, ethnic, sex, or race, as well as for people in general, for individuals who exist within marginal cultural spaces and speak and write in their own marginal language. These people are mute. Either we don't hear them, or we don't understand their language. At best, we are multicultural and let them be, or articulate for them their interests and defend their rights, depending on how we interpret them through our concepts. The crying absence of Russian women's voice in Israeli feminist community is a case in point. Let us propose a different approach to a melting pot or a multiculturalism continuum, both of which consist of monological and discourse in relation to immigrants, as opposed to this, we propose a polyphonic dialogicality. Bakhtin, the problem of imbalanced relation is not to be countered with power sharing based on considerations of equality. It needs to be addressed with polyphony, the principle of engaged coexistence, of multiple yet unmerged voices. Polyphony is a fascinating fusion of ethical and aesthetical considerations applied to human relations. The most beneficial relation in encounters is dialogue. In democracy, dialogue is a mode of being. Bakhtin disassociates dialogue from equality. In an imbalanced relation, which is the case of the encounters between veteran Israelis and new Israeli immigrants, he would suggest the general way of mutuality. Bakhtin's principle of polyphony offers a new way of reconciling power imbalance with mutuality of relation. The polyphony creates mutuality, and only this kind of relation should be used in creating discourse and dialogue for the beneficial relation. In the relational universe, the absolute duty of each human being is to relate to others. None has the right to exist in isolation. The pure, true dialogical encounters may happen only within the polyphony. Bakhtin thought of a multitude of different disagreeing voices, each existing through and with another voice. The very notion of difference he perceived as another form of connectedness. For him, being different was not a reason for an independent and isolated existence. Rather, one can only live out one's difference through others. In other words, just as sameness and similarity can serve as both grounds for connection or as grounds for separation, difference may be both an excuse to part ways and a reason for relations. The relational understanding of difference is the foundation for Bakhtin's notion of polyphony. The non-teleological dialogicality is not an absence of any connection. It is a principle that allows for inconsistent messages to be organized in a non-hierarchical and inclusionary manner. It is a way of staying engaged and talking while not leading toward more or less violent or more or less exclusionary consensus. A community must present its complex and contradictory moral voice as a multitude of mutuality addressed voices, not as a unified and consistent whole. Do we create another narrative? One moment. Do we create another narrative of dialogue and polyphony with Bakhtin's help? Hopefully not. Bakhtinian dialogue has no end and no other purpose but perpetuation of dialogue. Dialogue is a strictly non-teleological good. Bakhtin rejects the linear time of modernity, where history has an end. Rather, he accepts the present as privileged time, as time of fullest existence. Dialogue, in its Bakhtinian sense, is universe, is universal, but is not a project. It does not imply any particular goal, which would be characteristic of a grand narrative. For Bakhtin, meaning is born at the point of touching of different consciousnesses. He does not share the postmodernist assumption that if only one leaves the marginalized cultural groups alone, they will somehow define themselves from within and develop authentic identities. He thinks that lack of relations between people is a big and evil, as the presence of domineering relations between them. Polyphony allows for disagreement, but it forbids ignoring the opponent. For a word, and consequently for a human being, there is nothing more terrible than a lack of response. Bakhtin, speech genre and other late essays. Thank you.
I certainly don't want to stifle anyone else's voice, but since we're running late and I have to leave at 2:15 on the dot, I've been rather stringent in monitoring everyone. Thanks to the speakers for their intriguing investigations into important, although hardly investigated aspects of Russian-Israeli society and culture, and thanks to the conference organizers for asking me here to offer my comments. As I see it, the papers fall into two rather neat sets of dichotomies. In the first one, we have a small group of Russian-born young men and a large group, some 25,000 individuals, of elderly male and female war veterans. The second is comprised of a small group of Russian-born gays, lesbians, bisexuals, and transgenders, and a very large number, over 500,000 women, who emigrated from the former Soviet Union in the 1990s. I will be focusing my discussion on these dichotomies. First, Alon spoke of young people, whom I am calling Ruski rockers, who choose to sit on the sidelines, surrounded by a wall of sound of their own making. This wall of sound, comprised of music, text, and context, blocks out commercialism and politics, and, although Alon did not dwell on it, obligations of kinship and family as well. The decidedly nihilistic stance of these Israel-based Russian rockers is, as Alon pointed out, holier than thou. The diaspora has exceeded the homeland in its stringent requirements for outsider status. In Alon's words, the Israeli rock community, and here I place that word community in quotes, has become the last fort of authentic rock music. What is ironic in Alon's discussion is this notion of authenticity. Russian rock is obviously a hybrid genre, imported from the West and amended over the years. The styliagi of the mid-20th century used rock music and its associated clothing, hairstyles, and stances to protest what Russian teenagers in the mid-1990s remembered out loud to me as the bad old days when everyone, quote, looked like we had all come out of the same incubator. In the 1980s, Russian rock reached its peak of fluorescence, but as Pilkington and Cushman both note, in the 1990s it seemed to succumb to the global pulls of commercialism. Die-hard Russian nihilists have to work very hard to resist these tendencies. Michael Urban, in his 2004 book, Russia Gets the Blues, reveals that some Russians who reject commercialized pop rock for music of the soul find in the African-American musical genre of the blues an authentic Russian voice. In Israel, however, it seems from Alon's work that the soulful sounds of the blues are not attractive. Instead, the heavy metal sounds and lyrics that focus on, as one of his informants said, the next 20 minutes, not the next 20 years, have created their own logic in what appears to be an exclusively, and correct me if I'm wrong, male domain. Instead of pursuing opportunities in Israel to join the nation, these young men refuse the task of future building. In asserting that he didn't want to return to the historical motherland and only came for the sake of his grandparents, Ilya, another one of Alon's no longer teenaged informants, reverses what was a central Russian Jewish emigre slogan of the 1970s and 80s, "We came for the sake of our children." Which leads me to Ina's analysis of elderly Red Army veterans of World War II in Israeli public space. These veterans, men and women, bearing kilograms of beribboned medals as they march in Victory Day parades, were already quite old when they emigrated from the former Soviet Union in the 1990s. 25,000 is a staggering figure, more than a quarter of that migration wave. Why did they come? In the 1970s in the USSR, when young and middle-aged applicants for exit visas were told that if they wanted to leave the best country in the world, the country that had nurtured them and bestowed upon them the culture and education they so valued, they would have to take out their old, sick pensioner parents and grandparents. These old people often left reluctantly, abandoning their friends, apartments, and cherished status as war veterans for the sake of the children. But in some cases that I know of at least, it was precisely the old sick pensioner parents who initiated the exit process. Despite the glory of distinguishing themselves in the Red Army, the painful contradictions of being Soviet and Jewish pushed them beyond imagining alternatives into a very real migration process that was aimed at attaining better times and places for themselves, their children, and their grandchildren. It seems to me that those elderly Soviet Jews who did not leave in the 1970s made statements just as loud as those who did leave. Jumping forward some 20 years, it also seems to me that the fall of the Soviet Union was very hard for all World War II Red Army veterans. If I recall correctly, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, there were no state-sponsored massive rallies or celebrations for Dzień Pobieda, the May 9th VE Day, that Ina has discussed after 1991 until last month, when President Putin staged an extravaganza marking its 60th anniversary. When I did see be-medaled World War II veterans en masse in Moscow in the mid-1990s, they were demonstrating in Communist Party rallies, protesting the present ills of a non-egalitarian democracy that no longer valued the sacrifices and contributions that they had made for the collective. In the Soviet Union, many Jewish war heroes tried to push their Jewish marginality to the side by emphasizing their selfless service to the motherland. But with the fall of that country and its communist ethos as well, who were they now? I think the analysis that Ina gives of their discursive attempts to place themselves into the mainstream of Israel's narrative of nation building is right on the money. Here in Israel, they can recoup their hero status as Giborei HaShoah, not victims of the Nazi death camps or the Soviet gulags, but active contributors to the victory against totalitarian evil. In liberating Auschwitz, in battling the Nazis, and surviving communism, they are claiming a central place in world history and in Israel. I love Dalila's insistence on equating patience and wisdom with her advanced age, and thereby transforming dismissive Israelis, and not just school kids, into children who needed to hear what her medals mean in order to understand their own place in the world. To sum up, for me, Alon's paper showing youthful nihilism and Ina's paper showing the activity of disabled elders claiming a place in the nation together create an anti-structuralist reversal of age stereotypes and the cause and effects of FSU migration. The next set of papers also presents an ironic set of contrasts. Adi's paper focuses on a small group of FSU immigrants, gays, lesbians, bisexuals, and transgenders, GLBTs, who have rejected the closet and are refusing to be placed by the toilets. Sonia and Masha ponder the paradox that although over 500,000 women immigrants from the FSU reside in Israel as citizens of the state, their voice, and here I need to add an S and call them voices, are not heard. I'd like to first say a few words about Sonia and Masha's analysis and then return to Adi's jewel of a paper. Sonia and Masha began their presentation by stating of Russian Israeli women, quote, "We don't hear them, we may hear about them," end of quote. Looking to Bakhtin's linguistic theory of polyvocality to explain this paradox, they suggest that FSU immigrant women are not members of feminist organizations because Israeli feminist discourse is monologic and refuses them a place. Okay, I can buy that. But I would also add that the academic feminist discourse that they have described, and I think stereotyped, excludes most Israeli women, not only those who came out from Russia. The authors are onto something, but their argument would be so much stronger if, in describing second-wave feminism as an elitist discourse, they would consider how the daily womanly practices of most Israeli-born women, Mizrahiot, Palestinians, and Ashkenaziot, have much in common with Russian Israeli women. From what I've learned from my students over the years, a wide range of Israeli women believe, like FSU women, that they possess equal rights under the law. That struggle has been won. It is outside the sphere of civil law where the struggle persists. Likewise, they may mention that due to laws of gender blindness, a different travesty has become entrenched. Women are not recognized or valorized for their female difference. In these regards, most Israeli and Russian Israeli women shun and are shunned by the small number of, okay, let's call them academic feminists. But two things in Sonia and Masha's argument irk me. First is their collapsing of difference within Western feminism. In building their case for feminist monologism, Sonia and Masha have overlooked the impact of the 1990s, especially that of standpoint theory on, for better or for worse, academic feminism. Women of color, lesbians, working-class women, cultural feminists, not to mention Madonna, and overlaps among and between them, have all critiqued that one feminist model that they put forth, and these critiques have borne fruit. Here in Israel, some Mizrahi women are protesting exclusion from the academic mainstream and have formed their own feminist organizations. Let us also not forget Vicky Knafel, who recently became an icon of single mothers as she waged a battle for recognition and assistance from the Israeli welfare state. Second is their insistence that with the domination of public over private in the Soviet Union, women believed that the woman question was indeed solved. Yet, the Moscow Center for Gender Studies was established as an academic unit and NGO in 1990, before the fall of the Soviet Union, to, and I quote, improve the condition of women and ensure gender equality. Just as important, many analysts have noted that the dominance of public over private in the Soviet Union created unrecognized sites of communitas and resistance among family, within small and intense friendship groups, and around the kitchen table. In these cozy, uyutnia, if not private places, women could and did complain about the pains of abortion and the lack of less intrusive birth control devices, and sought solace and help from each other when seeking sanitary cotton and tampons. Why was it, they wondered, that equal civil rights necessarily meant biological and emotional deprivation? And now a personal story with which I hope to lead into Adid's thought-provoking analysis. One day, in November 1995, I boarded a train from St. Petersburg to Moscow. It was one of those new deluxe added lines, and for a few dozen more rubles, I hoped to escape the crowds. Not surprisingly, there weren't many travelers. Yet, instead of seating the 6 passengers in the 2 compartments that were indicated on our tickets, the conductor placed the 6 of us in one 6-person compartment. I grumbled, to no avail, and once seated, I opened up some English language novel and started to escape into it, but not for long, because the young man seated opposite me, a cadet in the St. Petersburg Naval Academy, struck up a conversation in halting English. After we shifted to Russian, I asked all my fellow travelers if they agreed with the decision to cram us together in this one compartment instead of spreading us out more comfortably. One woman took my question as the springboard for railing against the materialism of inostranci, foreigners like me, who, instead of communing with and praising the magnificent artwork in the Hermitage, only complain that the museum hasn't a nice cafeteria and that the toilets are lacking. Как вам не стыдно, she asked. Aren't you ashamed to be thinking of biological needs instead of the spirituality of these beautiful pieces of art? Since she reminded me of something I preferred to forget, the rather terrible toilets in the Hermitage, I told her that my appreciation of art is only enhanced when the toilets are sanitary. Why should such a beautiful museum filled with priceless treasures be marred by odors and filth? Before she could deliver, and she did deliver it, her speech about the spiritual qualities of the Russian soul that transcends crass materialism, another woman who had been sitting quietly said, I lived for a year in Germany, and I must agree with our colleague, meaning me, here. Denying our material needs and bodily functions has not made us Russians nobler as a people. It has only debased us. The haunting of the Mesto u Parashi that Adi has described, I would suggest, is double. Those who are placed by the latrines are deemed filthy, and since like deserves like, They are made to withstand the odious sounds and offensive odors that come from the latrines. At the same time, because they are stigmatized, their placement as filth next to filth legitimizes physical, including sexual attacks upon them by those who are bigger and stronger. But the irony here is that no matter what we might wish for, every one of us, me especially, needs to use the toilet at least a couple of times a day. We may hold our breath and pinch our nose once in that place, but en route, when we confront the so-called political undesirables, criminals, and sexual deviants, whose bodies and their specters haunt our path, each of us, normal people, is reminded that we too create dirt and might at some time be turned into it. We fear that place by the toilets not so much because of the shadowy figures residing nearby, but because the shadows they cast remind us that that place might turn out to be ours. This fear, the double haunting, was brilliantly manipulated, as Adi has shown, by Russian-Israeli GLBTs. By marching in the gay pride parade and talking back to the institutionally supported high cultural voice of the Russian-Israeli community, as expressed in and by Vesti, the GLBTs are rejecting the moral authority of what had once been their homeland, the now defunct Soviet Union. They are doing so by using the voice of highest moral authority in their new home country, the discourse of liberal democracy based on the principles of human rights and personal dignity. But they are astute enough to know that to win over their fellow Russian speakers, such Western Enlightenment rhetoric is not enough. Well-versed in the meanings attached to Yevreistva and Am Yisrael, and the catastrophic dangers that befell Jews in Nazi-occupied Europe and in Stalin's Soviet Union, they reversed the equation of normal with heterosexual and abnormal with homosexual by revealing the mainstream moralistic writers and readers of Vesti who persecute gays and lesbians as anti-Semitic perverts. The gays and lesbians then re-emerge as central to the Jewish state, righteously fighting off fascist oppression by boorish thugs, despite their ability to quote poetry and invoke the Bible. This session was entitled Projects of Identity with the S in parentheses, but I've read these papers under the rubric of discursive, political, and cultural diversity. Each in its own way makes an important contribution toward busting the hard and fast stereotypes that we hear every day in Israel about the Russians. And most important of all, in promoting a humanistic politics, they each take a step forward toward challenging the entrenchment of domination while rejecting the placement of anyone deemed different by the toilets. Thanks.